Hello everyone, welcome back to History of Presidential Debates, lecture number 2. How did we get the modern debates? In the last lecture, I talked about the importance of the Lincoln-Douglas debates as well as the Foote Amendment debate between Webster and Hayne, and also how debates were surrogate. That's the 19th century climate. For this lecture, I'm going to introduce you to my friend, Governor Adlai Stevenson. Here he is. Now, he looks like a very happy man, but on the inside, he's pretty upset. On the inside, Adlai is crying. Why was he so upset? Well, Adlai Stevenson is one of these American political figures who had national attention and fame in his time, but didn't really win any big elections. He was governor of Illinois and very popular and won the Democratic nomination for president twice. First in 1952 and second in 1956. Yeah, get you a candidate who has his own cigarettes. He's upset because he ran twice against this guy, General Eisenhower. And I don't think I need to explain to you that even if you're the best governor Illinois has ever had, it's very, very tough to defeat the guy who beat Hitler. Stevenson really wanted to run a third time and tried to become a dark horse last-minute write-in candidate at the Democratic National Convention, but did not succeed. John F. Kennedy was nominated as the Democratic Party's candidate for president in 1960 against Vice President Richard M. Nixon. Stevenson reflected on why it was that he might have lost, and he thought it was because he did not have access to the American people in a homogeneous or whole way. He's really upset because when he goes to Florida, he has to talk about citrus beetles. And when he goes to Wisconsin, he has to talk about cranberry bog stuff and drink cranberry juice in front of the press. He's like, I'm running for president. I don't need to do this stuff. Where's the National Forum on National Issues? Stevenson was pretty grumpy about this, and he was approached by the major magazine, news magazine, weekly magazine called The Week, to write something about the upcoming 1960s election. What was it going to be like? Stevenson took the opportunity to write 2 extensive pieces that got national influence. The first was, why do we run for president this way? And the second was his alternative, The Great Debate Night in America. Both of these were criticisms of the primary system. Stevenson thought he didn't do too well in those elections because of the primary system. He was unhappy that he had to go to Wisconsin and Florida and places like that in order to get the votes to become the candidate. But he was more upset, I think, by the fact that he didn't have access to the people the way his opponent did. Eisenhower in 1956 had national access, and Stevenson could not get TV time because of what's called the Equal Time Doctrine. Equal time was part of the FCC Telecommunications Act of 1934, which governed the airwaves. In this act, Section 315 explicitly states that if one privately owned broadcasting company decides to grant time to a viable candidate, it must grant equal time on its airwaves in the same manner to every other viable candidate. So, for example, if a radio station sells a commercial to a Republican candidate, they have to sell that same amount of time at that same price to a Democratic candidate, or whoever it might be. The trouble that you get into here is that in a presidential race, you have a lot of people who are official candidates. What does it mean to be viable? What does it mean to be a candidate? Well, at that time, it was like if you were registered and you were on the ballot, you could get that time. So you can imagine if there are 30-something crazy people running for president, how that would bankrupt a media company. Stevenson's test of equal time came in 1956 when the Eisenhower administration faced its second big crisis, the Suez Canal crisis. President Nasser of Egypt decided to nationalize the Suez Canal Company and say it was now Egyptian property as a move against the colonial history Egypt faced from the French, the British, and others. Even though the Egyptian government compensated the French and British for the company fairly, they still thought that it was their property, and they were worried about Egyptian influence over the Suez Canal, an incredibly important waterway for the shipping of all kinds of goods and services. It still kind of is. Ever given anybody? Remember that? The French and the British had meetings with the Israeli government, thinking that perhaps they should invade and take the canal back by force in order to not disrupt trade. Eisenhower didn't want to appear that way. He had just gone nationally against, or internationally, against the Soviets for their crackdown on the Hungarian Revolution that same year. He wanted to differentiate the United States and say that they would not crack down on the legacy of colonialism like the Soviets did. It was a good way to make that difference. He went on television and gave a 30-minute address explaining why they were going against their allies, the British and the French, and why the Americans would not support this move and wanted to broker a ceasefire between the Egyptians, the Israelis, the French, and the British in the UN. Stevenson, running for president at the time, said, "I deserve 30 minutes to explain my point of view on Suez," but he was denied by the FCC. Why? The FCC ruled that Eisenhower was speaking as the president, not as the Republican candidate for presidency. This small difference really irked Stevenson and others who thought that equal time should preserve an open discussion about the issues. So Stevenson wrote his piece. In it, he complains mostly about the primaries. He says, look at this great quote, "No one would pretend that cranberry chemicals and citrus diseases do not deserve attention. Of course they do. But so much attention from the highest temporal office on earth? Isn't it time we grew up?" Stevenson's kind of a straight shooter. Maybe it wasn't just Eisenhower that's the problem here. I don't know. But he didn't get his equal time. He was frustrated. So he said, we have the technology and ability to get rid of these small primary issues and bring our case to the American people directly. We can do that through the medium of television. He proposed that once a month, or maybe even more frequently, there should be a national airwave debate on the issues that face America, not the issues that face regional states or parts of the country, but what faces America. What are those big political issues, and have an airing out. And it should be a debate. He wasn't really 100% committed to a debate model, but that's kind of what stuck in the essay. If you look at the image of how it was presented, it looks like a giant national debate on TV that everyone in the country would be a part of. And I think his vision was for national debate about national issues instead of the strong regionalism that the presidential primaries necessitated. The response was pretty quick. Congressional hearings were held. National discussions were held throughout the media, and Congress had a hearing to decide what to do. Stevenson testified before Congress and told them that he thought that the rules should be changed, the law should be changed, a bill should be introduced in Congress to create this thing to happen. The president of NBC at the time replied that this would be a horrible violation of the First Amendment to force broadcasting companies to carry content they don't want to carry. So if NBC or CBS decided they didn't want to carry the national debate or Stevenson's national debate, then they shouldn't be forced to do it. This is exactly why the Telecommunications Act was passed, to prevent the government from manipulating the airwaves in case somebody dangerous got in power and told people how to feel, what to think, or what to do. The result was this, a 1-year suspension to test the idea of Section 315. That suspension meant that equal time was no longer on the books for the presidential race, and the Democratic and Republican candidates would face each other in a series of 4 debates to be carried on all of the major networks. The different networks volunteered their studio and TV time in different parts of the country, and the 1960 debates were ready to go. Adlai Stevenson, even though he never became president, his influence is enormous in the fact that we can directly trace the format and the way the debates work today to his 1960 essay in the Week talking about a national forum for debate. Now, would Stevenson be happy with what this has turned out to be like? I'm not really sure. I think he wanted more of a discussion on issues rather than kind of an argument back and forth about who the better candidate was. I think he wanted a way to give his perspective on the country as a whole instead of having to work through the primary system to get regional support in order to maybe have that national audience. If somebody's a sitting president, they have a lot of power under the 1934 Telecommunications Bill. That power was really used most well, I'd say, by FDR, whose fireside chats as the president brought him into the living room of every home with a radio. And it's hard to fight against somebody who's got direct access to every person in the country once a week. In the next video, I'll talk a little bit about a couple of 20th century debates I think that are important to understand in order to understand why the 1960 debate between Kennedy and Nixon is so important, why it's a part of that tradition of American televised debate or broadcast debate, and how it really changed things and maybe not for the better.